Lisa.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Brown Bag with Sarah Wolak, and we have Bill Sherling with your introduction today.
Thank you, Shawnee, and thank you, Sarah, for being here today. Really looking forward to this brown bag. Sarah Wolak will be sharing her experiences through hiking the 2,170 mile long Appalachian Trail.
Today's Brown Bag with
You're
Sarah
mute that.
Wolak.
Hold on, got a little problem.
Bill Sherling with your introduction today.
Can you mute that or turn it on? Sarah, for being here today.
If you hit the pause button.
Can you stop that? Turn that off. It's repeating what I just said. It's interrupted the middle.
I do apologize for that, everyone. So Sarah Wolak grew up in South Florida in a family that loved taking month-long summer camping trips around the country and exploring the outdoors. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in wildlife ecology and conservation from the University of Florida, and then went on to work as a field biologist in all sorts of ecosystems in Missouri, Florida, New Mexico, Oregon, Massachusetts, Nevada, and Montana. During these nomadic years, she fell in love with backpacking and was inspired by a fellow field biologist's tales of hiking the Appalachian Trail. She decided to hike the trail herself before heading to graduate school at the University of California, Riverside. In California, she met her husband, and after graduate school, the two of them moved to northern Scotland, where he worked as a postdoctoral research fellow. 4 years and 2 children later, they found themselves moving to Auburn, Alabama. She now spends her time caring for their 2 boys and propagating thousands of native plants for her fledgling native plant nursery. Her boys are only up to about 5-mile hikes so far, but she fully intends to take them with her when she through hikes the Appalachian Trail again, hopefully in 6 more years. Sarah?
All right, thank you for the introduction, Bill and Shawnee, and thank you to everyone involved in the OLLI program for inviting me to give this talk and relive this experience. I hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2005, so 16 years ago now, and it's wonderful to be able to look back through all of my pictures and journal entries and relive this experience. Now, before I get started, I always tell people there are 2 great reasons to hike the Appalachian Trail, in addition to the obvious joys of hiking and immersing yourself in nature. And the first reason is the food, not because the food you eat on the trail is delicious. It's definitely not. Most of my dinners consisted of some sort of prepackaged rice or pasta meal that you could cook in a single pot of water. But if you've ever wished that you could eat a king-size Snickers bar every morning at 10 a.m. and burn it off before lunchtime, then the trail is just the ticket. I remember when I was preparing for my hike, I had read that it would take about 2 weeks for your metabolism to dramatically ramp up. And for me, it was about 9 days. And on my 9th day, I stayed at the Wolak Historic Inn in northern Georgia, and a bunch of hikers were spending the night there and had decided to order pizza. And I ate an entire large pepperoni pizza myself, and I was still hungry, so I chased it with an entire box of Thin Mint Girl Scout cookies. And I should have woken up the next morning feeling awful, but instead I was ravenous. And I remember thinking, well, this is going to be awesome. And I understood then why the guidebooks to the Appalachian Trail will list for you every single place in close proximity to the trail that carries ice cream or Snickers bars. The second reason I tell people that they should hike the trail is for the people. If you ever need your faith in humanity restored, go hike the Appalachian Trail. There's a phenomenon that everyone will experience on the trail that is called Trail Magic, and the people who give it, we call trail angels. The trail angels are people who will just overwhelm you with their generosity. And it might be something really little and simple, like you're walking along and suddenly there's a box of candy bars that somebody has left on the side of the trail for hikers. Or it might be a cold night where somebody shows up with a big pot of hot stew at a shelter and feeds all of the hikers there. And sometimes it's something even bigger than that, like a complete stranger inviting you into their home and saying, go ahead, use my shower, use my washing machine and do your laundry, and here's a warm, dry bed to spend the night in. And so the amount of trust and goodwill shared between complete strangers on the trail is just mind-blowing. And it's a big part of the through hiking experience. And no matter how many times it happens to you, no matter how big or how small, every single time, it's amazing and special. So before I launch into the story of my through hike, I'd like to share a little bit of the history and some fun facts about the trail. So it starts here on Springer Mountain in Georgia, and it finishes on Katahdin in Maine. So the trail was the brainchild of a forester named Benton McKay, who was actually the very first graduate of Harvard's School of Forestry in 1905. And he had this grand vision for a trail that would connect farms with wild areas and wilderness camps and be a respite for city dwellers. And so he had this article published in an academic journal in 1921 called An Appalachian Trail, a Project in Regional Planning. And the idea gained publicity when the New York Evening Post picked up on this article and ran a front page headline saying, "A great trail from Maine to Georgia." And after that, lots of people came together to start making this happen. And so the first 20-mile stretch was completed in New York from the Hudson to Ramapo rivers in 1924. And the trail was completed by 1937 and was 2,140 miles long. Now, one funny thing about the trail is that it actually keeps getting longer. So when I ended up hiking it in 2005, the official mileage tally was 2,179 miles. But at this point, it's actually up to 2,190 as the trail gets rerouted. So it goes through 14 states from Georgia to Maine, and it generally takes about 5 to 7 months to complete the hike. Some fun facts: you do not have to be any sort of super athlete to be a through hiker. You just have to have a lot of grit and determination and just be ready to endure some less than pleasant conditions. And the oldest through hiker was Dale Graybeard Sanders, who did it as an 82-year-old in 2017. The first woman through hiker was Peace Pilgrim, who did it in 1952. And just a few years later, the first solo woman through hiker did the trail. And this is her picture here. And I just love this woman. This is Emma Gatewood, who did the trail when she was 67 years old. She was called Grandma Gatewood. She had 23 grandchildren at this point. And you can see that sack flung over her shoulder. Well, this was before we had invented all these fancy backpacks and lightweight tents and all this really lightweight, super specialized gear. And so seeing that this 67-year-old woman could do this whole trail with a big sack flung over her shoulder was just so impressive to me. Now, for the first 30 years of the trail's existence, not many people did the whole trail. Only 59 are recorded. But after the 1970s, the trail's popularity became, it increased. And in 2008, the 10,000th hike completion was recorded. And so it's actually the Appalachian Trail Conservancy is a nonprofit. It started as the Appalachian Trail Conference in 1925. And they are in charge of managing the trail, and they keep a record of every person who completes the trail. Now, at this point, more and more people are able to complete it each year. So about 25% of the people who start the trail are able to finish it. Now, I referenced the green tunnel in my title because much of the Appalachian Trail is going through dense, lush forests, and you do feel like you're walking in a green tunnel. Because I'm a person who loves plants, this is not a problem. But for some people, it was frustrating to be in a green tunnel for so much of the time, and especially for people from Western states. And they were disappointed by the relative lack of grand views compared to all those mountains out west. Now, I'm a person who dearly, dearly, dearly loves the West and its mountains, but I also get a bit defensive when people poo-poo the mountains in the East. So one thing that I like to bring up is that surprises people is that the Appalachian Trail is actually the most physically difficult of the 3 long distance trails in this country. So you can see the Appalachian Trail is the shortest at 2,200 miles, whereas the Pacific Crest Trail is 2,600 and the Continental Divide Trail is 3,100. But in that shorter distance, the Appalachian Trail packs in a whole lot more elevation gain. And when you look at how trails are rated for difficulty, a difficult trail is one where the steepness or grade is greater than 15%. And so 11% of the Appalachian Trail falls into that difficult category, which you can compare with the Pacific Crest Trail, which is relatively flat by comparison because it was designed for pack animals to do, whereas the Appalachian Trail was designed purely for hikers. And so you can see on this figure here, it might be a little bit confusing, but the red triangles represent the Appalachian Trail, and a slope of 0 means flat. So you can see that there are much fewer miles on the Appalachian Trail hovering in that flat range than on the Pacific Crest Trail or on the Continental Divide Trail. And there are a lot of statisticians out there that like to crunch the numbers on these sorts of things. And somebody went through and analyzed every half-mile segment of the 3 trails and found the steepest section was here on the Appalachian Trail in New Hampshire, from Pinkham Notch up to Wildcat East, where you have a 2,000-foot elevation gain in 1.5 miles, including 1,000 feet in just half a mile, which works out to a 38% grade. Very steep. That said, though, the Appalachian Trail is definitely the easiest of the 3 hikes in terms of logistics. It's much older and has a longer history, and it goes through the more populated East. So your ability to resupply with food or to escape to a hotel or hostel for a warm bed for a night, or for whatever reason you needed to get off the trail and get help, much easier to do on the Appalachian Trail. Whereas on the PCT and then especially on the CDT, you can have the much more potential to get yourself in trouble if you haven't planned appropriately. So now let's look at some pictures from my hike. So the first funny thing about the Appalachian Trail is that the only way to get to the start of the trail is by hiking to it. And so there's actually a 9-mile approach trail just to get to the start of your hike. And so this is me setting off on that approach trail with a giant pack that at that point weighed close to 50 pounds. So you find out pretty quickly which things you've packed that you do not actually need. And again, about 9 days in that Wolak Inn, there's also an outfitter right there on the trail where the employees will take apart your entire pack and go through item by item and say, you're not going to need this, send this home, or make suggestions for swapping out gear, which I ended up doing and reducing that pack load quite a bit. So since the trail starts in northern Georgia, only about 75 miles of the trail are in Georgia, plus that 8.8 mile approach. And when you start your hike, you can register at the visitor center in Amicalola Falls State Park so that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy can start recording your thru hike. And while I was there, I met this older gentleman who decided to go by the trail name Poppy, which is what his grandchildren called him. And my mom was with me, dropping me off. And she, of course, was terribly nervous about letting her 26-year-old daughter go off alone in the woods for months. But Poppy is what we had called her father, my grandfather. And so she decided to take this as a sign that everything was going to be just fine because Poppy was on the trail too. So I'm glad she had that little moment of relief. And this picture on the right is one of my first pictures from the trail. And as you can see, it is not spring yet there, but it was a beautiful foggy morning. And I loved the way the white blaze marking the trail showed through the fog there. These pictures show some of the kinds of places where I spent the night. All along the Appalachian Trail, there are these 3-sided shelters for hikers to use. And most of the thru-hikers take advantage of those whenever they can, because it's just way more convenient than setting up and taking down a tent every night, especially if it's raining. It's nice to just have a dry place you can get into. But there were nights when I set up tent, which down here you can see I started with a simple tarp tent. And then I also took advantage of a lot of hostels or other sorts of places that were offered to hikers. So this Blueberry Patch Hostel was just a little cabin on Gary and Lenny Podiat's land, and they would accept a $4 donation per night for hikers. And I ended up spending Easter Sunday with them, and they were lovely people. Now, I also referenced trail names. Trail names are something that some people came up with their own trail names, and then other people were given trail names. So down here in the green, my friend Hookie was a teacher who had left her teaching job early, but was sending back messages to her students. So everyone teased her about playing hooky from school. And then Spice Rack here was probably the only person on the trail who devoted a significant portion of his pack to a big Ziploc bag full of spices to jazz up his food. And for myself, that first night when we were all sitting around and talking to each other about who we were and where we were from, and I talked about being a bird biologist and my idea that if chickadees were our size, they would rule the earth. And then I also mentioned that I was going to be leaving after finishing my hike, would be starting a PhD program in California. And so they tacked the doctor on and said I should be Dr. Chickadee. And in retrospect, that was a terrible idea. And I joked that they jinxed me because while I did spend many years pursuing that PhD, I ended up deciding it was not the right path for me and not finishing it. But there is a small chunk of the world that only knows me as Dr. Chickadee. So you get through Georgia fairly quickly, which is very exciting to cross into your first state. So this is me by the border into North Carolina, not that you can read that sign. But then North Carolina and Tennessee, I've lumped their mileage together. It's about 371 miles through both states. And it's hard to really separate them because at times the trail is going right along the border. So who knows what state you're actually in at that point. And as you can see from these pictures, the weather was extremely variable. That's another thing people think, oh, well, the mountains there aren't that high. So, you know, if it's April, you should be fine. And no, we had a lot of snow. And the two pictures at the bottom, that's the same day. We started off hiking in the snow in the morning and it was beautiful. And by the end of the day, we had gotten down to the Nantahala Outdoor Center on the Nantahala River and we were in tank tops. These are some other pictures just showing some general aspects of trail life. So one thing, you hitchhike a lot on the Appalachian Trail, which again, as a young woman, seemed like an odd thing at first. But this trail is old and it has a long history, and the people who live along this trail are pretty used to seeing hikers with their thumbs out. And So it's actually pretty easy to hitchhike along the trail. And you do this because, well, sometimes there's a town right near the trail. Other times it's going to be a several mile walk. And you just don't want to keep tacking on all those extra miles. So we would hitchhike into town. And then some people would choose to resupply their food at grocery stores. But sometimes the grocery store might just be like a gas station mini mart. And you can always tell when people had resupplied there because there would be like a lot of little Debbies and ho-hos in their bags. For myself, I actually chose to buy all of my food ahead of time, and I packed up boxes and I had it all planned out, and I would send myself, well, my parents would mail the boxes to each of the post offices along the way where they would just be sent general delivery. And when you got into town, you could pick them up and be on your way. So this is a few of us by the Fontana Dam post office, and then we got back to the trail and stayed in what was called the Fontana Dam Hilton, which was a much swankier shelter than most of them because it had space for 20 hikers and actually had running water and showers. So we were feeling pretty posh that night. Next came the Great Smoky Mountains, which you can see from the pictures why they get their name. We were socked in foggy clouds for much of the time. This is my friend Cola on top of Rocky Top in Tennessee. And then this is Cola and myself and a couple called Train and Raindrop on top of Klingman's Dome, which is the highest point on the Appalachian Trail at 6,643 feet. And I had to include a picture of one of the shelters in the Smoky Mountains, which looks really awful with that chain link fencing. But that was actually to keep the bears out and the hikers in and protected at night. So we were fine with the chain link fence. And then every once in a while you have these surreal experiences. A bunch of us, after hiking through the Smokies and having been cold and wet for so long, decided to splurge on a hotel in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And after all that time in the cold and wet, to spend a day lying in the sun by a hotel pool felt pretty surreal. And also the other strange experience I had in Gatlinburg is that when I hitched into town, the person who picked me up happened to be a family friend of the very person who had inspired me to hike the trail in the first place, who I had met working a bird job in New Mexico. And so it's just very strange that that ended up happening. And hiking out of Gatlinburg, like the forest was starting to really green up and come into bloom. And again, being a plant person, I had to take a lot of pictures of plants. And on this day with me under the redbud, which is one of my favorite eastern trees, I think I only made it 3 miles that day because there were so many wildflowers blooming and everybody teased me about going camera speed. Now this picture I've included because people often ask me like, what my favorite night was on the Appalachian Trail. And it was this spot here. I had just hiked up out of Hot Springs, North Carolina with Cola. And we were looking for a place to camp. We weren't near a shelter and there was just nowhere flat around. And finally we found this little spit of land jutting out and it fell away on 3 sides down into a valley. And since it was the only flat spot we'd seen, we decided to set up camp. And I remember taking my pack off and just lying down and letting the coldness of the earth seep into my body and staring up at the sky and just feeling completely at peace with the world. And there was literally nothing remarkable whatsoever about this site. But that night, Cola and I talked about how wonderful this life was and how sad we were that so many people were afraid to be in the woods at night and so would never have this sort of experience. And I wrote in my journal that night, I want to feel alone with God and the forest and the heavens, to feel strong and capable and independent and connected to all of it. And that's exactly how I felt that night. And as the sun went down, we could see the lights of a town twinkling down below there. And even though I was grateful that I was in the woods with just one other person and all those people were down there, I felt connected to those people too. And it was just this absolute utter contentment. And people have asked if I would go back there if I could. And first of all, I don't think I could ever find it again because there was nothing remarkable about that spot. But also, I probably wouldn't feel the same way again. It was just in that moment, it was perfect. So around this time, we got out of the green tunnel a bit and we started having some grassy balds that we could hike over with nice views, which was a treat. These are some other spots in North Carolina. This is the Greasy Creek Friendly, which was just a little homestead in the middle of nowhere. There were no towns anywhere close by, but these folks had a home that was about a half mile off the trail and would let hikers stay there. And down here, this was an old barn on someone's farm that had been converted into a shelter for hikers that ended up being a delightful place to spend the night. And this is me just enjoying more of those spring wildflowers. And again, that weather was very, very changeable. So after lying in the sun on these mountaintops, we had more snow. And I've included, this is a shelter, the Iron Mountain shelter. I had not intended to go very far that day, and I had somehow miscalculated the mileage and ended up doing not only my first 20-mile day ever, but my first 24-mile day purely by accident. And all I could write that night was 24.3 miles through snow, uphill most of the way. And that was it. I was exhausted. The next day I set off with grand plans of making it far again and ended up coming to a road. Well, let me back up. It started to rain, it started to sleet, it started to hail, and then it started to snow more. And I came to a part where the trail crossed the road and I knew I had 2 more miles to go to get to the shelter I wanted to get to, or I could walk less than half a mile down the road to this spot here, which is called Kincora. And this is the home of an avid Appalachian Trail enthusiast, Bob Peoples, and his wife. And they actually built this whole addition onto their home just for thru hikers. And the temptation was too great. I ended up going there and it was packed to the brim with hikers trying to escape the snow. So all the bunks were filled, but I ended up spending the night on a warm sofa in front of a roaring fire and woke up to pancakes the next morning being cooked by Hellboy, which Hellboy got his name because I have never seen anybody who could start a fire faster than Hellboy. And one time I swear he just threw sticks at the ground and they burst into flames. The next state was Virginia, and you can see 544 miles. That's a quarter of the trail goes through Virginia. But the terrain starts getting easier there. You actually, instead of going up and down over every single mountain, you start getting ridge lines to walk. So this is where most people start doing 20-mile days on a regular basis. And it also, you start getting more pastoral areas, like this was somebody's farm that you just got to walk through their cow pasture to get to other parts of the trail. And these are some more of the friends that I met. This is Colonel Forbin and Spice Rack and Cola and Captain Crunch having a hot dog feast. And then in Parisburg, Virginia, my little brother actually joined up with me. He drove up from Florida and I met him. This is the Holy Family Church Hostel. And he had brought a feast that my parents had prepared. My dad especially loves to cook. So everybody who was there at the hostel that night got Vietnamese shrimp and pork salad and barbecue spare ribs and smoked salmon and cream cheese and steak sautés. And it was this huge feast. And it was wonderful having my brother with me for a week, partly because, you know, as the big sister, it was fun to show off a bit, especially because I was now in fabulous hiking shape and he was not. And I had just had to keep taking more and more weight out of his pack, and he was exhausted. But he was with me for a pretty great stretch through Virginia, where you get some more of these open views. And you can see here, this ridge line. This is an example of one of those ridges you get to hike in Virginia that make the going much easier. This is just some more time hiking through that area of Virginia, and my brother and Colonel Forbin are sitting there on McGaffey's Knob, which is probably the most photographed spot on the entire Appalachian Trail. Everybody likes to have their picture out on that rock. And my brother's week with me finished off with trail days in Damascus, Virginia, which the trail goes right through Damascus, and we had already passed it at this point, and so ended up having to hitchhike back 40 miles for this big celebration of through hiking culture that happens every year. And they have a big fairgrounds that through hikers congregate in, and people who hiked it in years past will come and join as well. And the through hikers parade down Main Street, and it's sort of tradition for there to be a water war between the hikers and the townspeople. So a lot of hikers went out and bought water guns, and then the townspeople are on their front porches with their garden hoses just spraying back and forth. And then afterwards, the hikers gave all their water guns to the kids in town, which incidentally, this kid here was one of the children that I met that was actually through hiking. So I think he was 8 years old. So after trail days in Damascus, I got back on the trail, and then I had this challenge of, I was actually scheduled to be a bridesmaid in my cousin's wedding in Maine. And I had a plane ticket out of DC for 4 days to be off the trail and go to Maine and be in this wedding. And I had really been enjoying hiking with Colonel Forbin and Captain Crunch. And they were a little bit faster than I was. And they said, well, how about this? You keep up with us. We'll stay with you. We're going to do 240 miles in 10 days and get you to Front Royal, Virginia, which is pretty close to DC. And then you can catch your plane. And so it was a pretty intense 10 days, doing back-to-back 20-mile plus days every day. I was exhausted, but at the same time, I did have time to take pictures of the trilliums and the lady slippers and the rhododendrons and just enjoy the beauty of the forest there. And one thing that I really laughed about after having finished the trail is you really get to know the forest very intimately when you're walking through it every day. I remember after the fact, being home with my mom, and we were watching the movie The Last of the Mohicans, which is supposed to take place in the Northeast. And I'm looking and I said, no, that's a Virginia forest. And sure enough, like Googled where it had been filmed, and it was in Virginia. So after my cousin's wedding, I flew back to DC and got back on the trail, and very soon arrived in West Virginia, where you only have 2 miles to go, and then into Maryland, where there are 41 miles to go. And this is where there's the trail has a lot of challenges, traditional challenges you can embark on. And one of them is to do 4 states in one day. So people will camp in Virginia, get up really early in the morning, do those 2 miles into West Virginia, do all 41 miles of Maryland, and cross into Pennsylvania. But for me, I personally did not need to have a 43 mile plus day. Like I was happy to just make it take a couple days. Now, another one of those traditional challenges is the half-gallon challenge. So once you cross into Pennsylvania, where there's about 230 miles up the trail, you reach the halfway point, which is in Pine Grove Furnace State Park. And you are encouraged to try buying a half-gallon of ice cream and eating the whole thing. Which I did buy the half-gallon, but with no intention of trying to force feed myself. These 3 guys, though, haiku AWOL and cola. They all finished their half gallons. And we heard stories of one of the women who was ahead of us who had actually managed to do it in 4 minutes, which I can't even comprehend how that's possible, but apparently she did it. Now, as I said, I had left the trail for 4 days, and I had really enjoyed hiking with the captain and the colonel. And so I kept trying to make up those 4 days and catch back up with them. And it was really making me miserable, pushing myself so hard to try and catch them. And I could feel myself getting sick. And so at this point, Cola told me, you know what, stop, take a day off, which we call a 0 day, and you need to recover. And one of the most important things you need to remember when you're doing a through hike is to hike your own hike. Everybody says it, but we all forget it at some point because you meet people that you really enjoy and you want to spend more time with them. And so then you start trying to be on their schedule, and you just can't do that. You're never going to be able to keep the same schedule as all the friends you make. And so you have to be willing to just let people walk back out of your life and hope that you're going to see them again. And so that day, hiking down into Port Clinch, Pennsylvania, I was hot and miserable and tired. And once I made the decision to just stop for a day, and I went and lay down in the river that went through town, and it was very shallow, so I could lie on the bottom of the river and with my face out of the water and just let it rush all around me and wash everything away. And I felt so much better after that. It was like recentering myself to say, hey, you are here to enjoy this experience, and pushing to catch up with people. Like, you're not going to enjoy it. So hike your own hike. And after that, I was able to see the beauty of Pennsylvania again. Now, Pennsylvania does get a very, very bad rap in all the guides to the Appalachian Trail. And as I was hiking through southern Pennsylvania, I thought, why is everybody hating on Pennsylvania? This place is beautiful. And then you get to northern Pennsylvania, and the trail becomes super, super rocky, such that there is never a flat place to put your foot. So at the end of every day, your knees and your feet are just aching. And it's summertime now, so it's hot, and the water sources are farther and farther and farther off the trail. So you might have to hike an extra 2 miles just to get more water. And of course, at this point, with all those rocks, I ended up bruising an ankle badly enough that it hurt to walk. And so I ended up having to cut up my sleeping pad and make a donut to stuff into my boot to relieve the pressure. And that worked. But I did join the ranks of people who were cursing Pennsylvania by the time I finished. And I don't know how well you can see it, but like I said, there were just rocks the whole way so that you never had a flat place to put your foot. And later in graduate school in California, I met another one of the grad students had thru-hiked, and he said, oh, do you remember a stretch in Pennsylvania where for 10 feet there were no rocks? And I said, no, I don't really remember that. He's like, well, I spent an hour clearing the rocks from that 10 feet. I was like, oh, well, if I ever go back, I'll try and enjoy it. So the next state is New Jersey, which about 74 miles of the trail go through New Jersey. And New Jersey is another state that people just always like to talk about how awful New Jersey is, but where the trail goes, I mean, it was beautiful. And I enjoyed every single mile of New Jersey, but still did not see a black bear, in spite of that actually having the greatest population density of black bears on the trail. Now in New York, my mom actually came and joined me for a week because she's from New York originally. And so we'd spent a while on the phone discussing what gear she needed to bring. And I tried to prepare, and I told her, you know, Mom, we are going to have to hitchhike to get into town. And she's like, we can walk the extra miles. I'm like, no, Mom, we're going to have to hitchhike. And she was not okay with that. Well, on the day that I was supposed to meet her in town, I had misjudged the difficulty of the terrain getting there. And so I was late, and it took me 2 hours longer than I thought it was. So my mom thought that she had misunderstood and put her pack on and set off to find the trail. But she was walking down the wrong road, and some nice man in a pickup truck pulled up next to her and, ma'am, do you know where you're going? And so she explained her situation, and he put her at ease by showing her pictures of his family and said, why don't you get in the truck and I will take you around and we'll look for your daughter. And so imagine my surprise after all this swearing that there would be no hitchhiking to show up in town. And there's my mom in some strange man's truck. And so she ended up hiking with me. And it was another case of, well, let me take more of that weight, Mom. And I had to keep lightening her pack. And at this point, for the through hikers, you're in such good hiking shape and you have a speed you like to go. And it was actually physically painful for me to slow down to the speed my mom was going. And we ended up having some points where, she was tired. So she was completely okay with choosing to do shortcuts where I would do the long route and then we would meet up again. And we just had a lovely week together doing New York. So next comes Connecticut, and there are 52 miles through Connecticut. And this is the stretch that I would actually most love to go back and see again. The trail was wide and flat and cushioned with all that leaf litter, but it rained the entire 52 miles for me. And I could see that there were so many beautiful spots I would have stopped if it weren't raining. And since it was only 52 miles, it was 2 days and it was over. So I would love to go back to Connecticut. And then Massachusetts, about 90 miles of the trail are in Massachusetts. And I got to spend 4th of July on top of Mount Greylock, which is the highest point in Massachusetts. And some other hikers and I had dinner up there, and we could see 7 different towns' fireworks displays from up there. But Massachusetts also brought black flies. And there was one point when Haiku and I were hiking through the woods and they were getting so bad that we stopped to find our insect repellent. But just in the time it took to take off our packs and start rummaging, they were swarming us so badly, we gave up, threw on our packs and ran the rest of the way into town. It was several more miles. But then we met a wonderful trail angel who said, hey, come on in and take a shower and chill out on my porch for a bit. And we were very grateful. After Massachusetts came Vermont and the Green Mountains, which were indeed very, very, very green. But Vermont was a little bit of a rude awakening because those mid-Atlantic states we were cruising through, and all of a sudden the terrain starts getting more difficult again. And you're wondering, why am I getting so tired every day? But it was beautiful. And at this point, I knew that I was going to make it to the end in time to move to California for graduate school. And so reading back through my journal, it was nice to see that I started spending more time going swimming in lakes that were beautiful. And hey, let me just lie on that rock in the creek for an hour and enjoy the sun. And this picture up at the top right was Bromley Peak in Vermont. And we had only gone 3 miles up to the top. Haiku and I were hiking together, and the weather was really bad. And so we decided to spend some time. There's a ski patrol cabin up there, and the weather did not clear and did not clear and did not clear. And the number of miles we wanted to do that day kept getting shorter and shorter and shorter until finally it turned into no more miles that day. Let's just sleep in the ski patrol cabin, and got up in the morning to this beautiful view, which was really gratifying. And it was nice to know that at this point, I felt very comfortable with finishing and didn't mind idling so much. So next is New Hampshire with 161 miles of trail. And this was my favorite stretch because I love alpine ecosystems. And this is the area where you get to be up above tree line and true alpine. This is Franconia Ridge, which was just a spectacular place to walk. The terrain there is really fragile. So in the White Mountains and the Presidential Range, you aren't allowed to just camp wherever. So you do have to put a little bit more thought into how far you're going to get and what the weather is doing, because up above tree line, you can't just set up a camp. And so this platform here shows one of the tent pads that were created for hikers to protect the vegetation and keep it all from getting trampled. And so these are some more views. This picture here, that's Mount Washington in the distance. So I was looking ahead to where I was going to be in the next couple days and just enjoying those endless mountain views. So as I approached Mount Washington, it was a beautiful day, but then of course the weather did change, because that is what Mount Washington is known for, is having some of the worst and most dangerous weather in the world. So once you're up there, like I said, there's nowhere to camp, but there are a series of what are called huts in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, but they're really lodges that are quite nice, that cater to tourists who aren't backpackers, but want to experience the backcountry. And so they can pay to stay in these lodges that have bunk beds and a kitchen with staff that cook their meals and whatnot. And so they have a little basement room for through hikers that get caught for bad weather. And it was already full, but there was no way they were going to send us either up or down the mountain. So we ended up sleeping in the dining room on the tables, which I can't remember why they told us to sleep on the tables rather than the floor. But for whatever reason, we slept on tables in this beautiful, beautiful lodge up on top of this mountain. And then the next day, summited Mount Washington, which has some of the highest recorded wind speeds in the world. And there's a visitor center up there. And if you go in the visitor center, it's rather grim. They have an entire wall dedicated to all the people who died on that mountain, with their names, dates, and the cause of death. So it is rather grim, and a reminder that don't take it too casually. So after getting through New Hampshire, came the last state on the trail, Maine, which has about 281 miles of trail. And I love Maine because it is 75% trees. And how can you not love that much forest? But right away in Maine, you have to do Mahoosic Notch, which is considered the most difficult mile on the trail, because it's a boulder field. And we're talking car and truck sized boulders. So you have to go over and under and around them and squeeze through areas where you can't wear your pack. And there's no physical way to just walk straight. So they said, plan for 2 hours. But of course, the folks I was hiking with were like, well, let's see how fast we can do it. And we made it through in about 45 minutes. But when you are used to plowing through the miles, to suddenly have 1 mile take that long was pretty crazy. These are some more scenes from Maine. My friend Haiku had a backpacking guitar he brought, so he would sometimes play music, and that was a dance party on top of Sugarloaf Peak with a thunderstorm in the background. And then this here is the Kennebec Ferry crossing the Kennebec River, which some people are very much purists about hiking the Appalachian Trail and want to hike every single foot of the trail. And since the trail crosses this river, too many people were saying, I'm going to walk across the river, which looks nice and safe, but often isn't. And after enough incidents of people getting swept away by the waters, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy made this canoe the official trail by painting a blaze on it. So if you don't take the canoe, you have not officially done the trail. Now, these pictures are from the 100-mile wilderness in Maine, which is where I experienced the coolest trail magic of my whole trip. So the 100-mile wilderness, as the name implies, is a stretch where for 100 miles, you don't come anywhere near a road. And so imagine our surprise when we're hiking through the 100-mile wilderness and suddenly there's a lemonade stand next to the trail. And 3 generations of a family are there with their little lawn chairs pulled up with all sorts of delicious cookies and pies and lemonade and sodas. And they just wanted to sit and share with us for a while. And the grandmother saw Haiku and his backpacking guitar. And she's like, oh, my favorite song is Desperado. Can you play that song? And he did happen to know it and sang it for her. And she was utterly charmed and could see her exchanging glances with her husband. And next thing we know, turns out he was a Maine lobsterman. And they said they had a cabin on the far side of this lake and would bring us a lobster feast if we wanted to join them on the shores of this lake. And so, of course, we wanted to join them. And so we hiked to the shelter where we were intending to spend the night and dropped our packs and ran back the mile to this lake. And sure enough, they showed up on a boat with tons of lobsters and corn on the cob and freshly baked cookies and beer and wine. And we just had this epic feast in this beautiful wild lake with Haiku playing his music. And then there were loons singing their wild song on the lake. And it was just magical. But the funny thing was we had left the shelter during the daytime and we're so excited about the lobster feast. None of us had thought to bring a headlamp. And so night fell. We had all had a beer or two and were pretty tipsy. And at this point, the trail was these two planks going through bogs for a mile. So if you can imagine a group of tipsy hikers in the dark with no headlamps trying to navigate two wooden planks for a mile, there was a lot of hilarity and stumbling. So these two shots are from very near to the end of my hike, and I was growing very reflective at this point. This is me with Katahdin in the background there. And that last night before reaching Katahdin, I spent by myself on this lake and had a beautiful sunset and got to just spend some time with myself, like reflecting on the whole experience. And I was really excited that I was going to be completing the journey and hiking up Katahdin, but also really sad that it was coming to an end. And then I was also looking forward to seeing my mom again and my aunt. Now, in retrospect, this was a terribly big ask for a child to make of their parent. But upon finishing the trail, I just couldn't bear the thought of hopping on an airplane and completing in a matter of hours what had taken me nearly 5 months to walk. And so I actually asked my mom to drive from South Florida up to Maine to pick me up and road trip back with me at the end of my hike. And I know that this is a really big ask, but it ended up being something she never would have traded for a second, because on her way up to Maine, she stopped in North Carolina where my brother was living at the time, and his wife was pregnant with their first child. And she developed preeclampsia and was rushed to the hospital and delivered her baby 2 months prematurely. So my mom just happened to be there for the birth of her first grandchild. And at this point, I was not in communication with my family. So just the morning of getting to Katahdin, my mom and my aunt showed up. And I also found out that I had suddenly become an aunt unexpectedly, much earlier than anticipated. And so that day was just filled with joy. And my mom and my aunt hiked with me for a couple miles, and then they could tell that I was just brimming over with energy and said, go ahead and go, we'll catch up. And my mom had brought a bottle of champagne, which I schlepped up the mountain and took this summit photo with all the other people who were summiting that day. And we all had some champagne in plastic cups and cheered the end of our journey, 2,179 miles. 149 days for me, so just shy of 5 months, and the experience of a lifetime. So with that, I thank you for watching, and if anyone has any questions, they are welcome to ask.
Yes, ma'am. I got one from our hiking instructor, Harold. He wants to know what are some of your favorite Alabama hiking destinations?
Alabama. Well, honestly, again, because I'm a plant person, I love being able to just go hike in the Tuskegee National Forest. And this is how I've learned all my plants here. But just recently, I did the Deadening Alpine Trail for the first time near Lake Martin. And that was pretty spectacular. I will say, though, that a lot of times the the descriptions of trails I feel are often overblown. And this one said, don't bring kids younger than 12. And I said, we'll bring our kids. It was nerve-wracking. There are a lot of drop-offs into Lake Martin where there aren't any railings or anything. And so with my 4-year-old who's more impetuous, I was gripping his hand pretty tightly. But I thought that that was a pretty great trail.
Do you have any questions, Bill Deutsch?
Well, yes, I do. First off, Sarah, what a fabulous job. Very inspirational hearing you speak and seeing all your nice photographs. That was one question. Did you bring a camera or were they all phone photographs, and how did you keep it charged?
Okay. So I was still using a film camera at that point.
Wow.
Yeah. So this was 16 years ago. So people did have cell phones, but they were not smartphones. And I suspect that things have changed a lot now. I imagine that everybody has their smartphone with all their trail apps on their phone. But I was very much a purist in terms of technology. And most people were at that time. Like, phones on the trail were frowned upon, not necessarily having them with you, but using them. Like a shelter one night, we all got to hear a woman call her boyfriend and talk for an hour. And it's just wasn't part of the experience that people were looking for. So I had a cell phone in what they call a bounce box, which when I got into town, I would just keep mailing that box further up the trail. And so then I would have access to a phone and a change of clothes for town so I could wash my hiking clothes. And I would keep resending it, but I did not actually carry a phone on the trail with me. Now, if I do this again with my kids, I will bring a phone, but it will not be something where I would call anybody from the trail or otherwise use it.
Has the phone changed the hiking culture? In other words, is every shelter now filled with women like that woman and everybody talking and blogging and texting? And does it take away from the hike?
I don't know. And honestly, I am a little bit scared about finding out because I do want to through hike it again. And I know that a lot of people now have GoPros strapped on so that they can video the entire hike and you can see YouTube videos of people's entire hike. So I'm hoping that there's still an ethos of like, let's be in the woods and enjoy being in the woods and not let the technology intrude. But certainly our phones have become so important to us that I imagine that they are much more prevalent now.
We just said goodbye to our friend from Flag Mountain, Nimble Nomad, who he's 82 now, but he'll be 83 when he finishes. So he wants to be the oldest.
Oh, okay.
You may have read, he wrote 10 million steps, but he lives on Flag Mountain, which is technically, or at least theoretically, the last 1,000-foot peak of the Appalachians. It's in near Weogufka, Alabama, but he lives up there on an old CCC cabin. And we went up to say goodbye to him. He actually walked 90 miles from Flag to, Springer Mountain. So he put a little more on it. But he's up in the Carolinas now, I believe.
Okay. It was interesting. I forget what state I was in, but it was somewhere far to the north when I had stopped in town and a bus full of senior citizens started unloading, and a very, very old man came up to me and asked me if I was hiking the trail. And I said yes. And he said, I built that trail back as a young man working with the CCC. And
Wow.
it's like, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's very cool. That's very cool. Did you see CCC structures all along the way?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interesting things, because the trail is so old, there's so much history. And I think it was in New Jersey, there was actually an interesting stretch where you would hike through some forest on a ridge, and then it would be clear, and then some more forest, and then it would be clear, and then some more forest and clear. And it turned out like that's where houses had stood at one point long ago, but had long since disappeared, except for, you know, some old stone walls. And so that was another interesting aspect of hiking the AT, is seeing how long people had been in this area.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm on a Zoom with you momentarily, and Shawnee, they'll probably kick us off of this in a minute, right? Does it end at 1?
It shouldn't automatically end, so I think we're good.
Okay, some end, yeah. But I know, and I hope you know, Sarah, that there were a few of us who are going to Zoom with you immediately after this talk.
Yeah.
I think your connection is failing on you, Bill.
Yeah, I dropped out about 12:45 and came back in a minute or two later. I have very unstable internet where I live out here in Lochapoka.
My personal question is how much, I mean, without having to, you know, go into it, but how long did it take you to prepare ahead of time? Because from my understanding, you had to know where all of these places on the trail were going to be. And then, of course, the food and all that kind of stuff. How long did it take ahead?
I started preparing in earnest about a month and a half ahead of time, but I had already been reading about it prior to that. But basically, once I had been accepted to grad school and knew that this was what I was going to be doing in the fall, it was like, okay, go time. And that's when I started deciding exactly how much food I was going to need for each leg of the journey, and going to Costco and buying giant boxes of Snickers bars and peanuts and M&Ms and all that kind of stuff, and making my mail drops and planning it out each step of the way. So there are a lot of resources out there for planning a through hike, down to like the 1/10 of a mile distance to each spot.
Wow.
And yeah, and everywhere where you can find showers, and everywhere where you can find laundromats, everywhere where you can find a bed for a few nights for pretty cheap. When you get into the Northeast, the guidebooks are very keen on telling you where to find Ben and Jerry's ice cream. So it is very well researched and great guidebooks put together by people. And now I know that there are phone apps that can do the same thing and tell you down to the last detail what to expect.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you in the next meeting.